Anita, as a child, you had a near-death experience when you were attacked by a hunting dog. Could you tell us about this incident? Yes, I was quite little, about 5.5 years old. My mother is a teacher by profession, and she was looking after 3 children in a household where there was also a hunting dog that lived mostly outside. It already had a bad reputation because once it bit the mailman. One of the children my mother was caring for was about my age, and one day, when it was very warm outside, we were playing together with the dog running around also. My mother had told me before not to get too close to the dog. So we were playing there, and the dog had discovered a dead bird, which was his prey, so to speak. And this made me very, very curious, just as much as my playmate. So we got closer and closer to the dog, watching what it was doing with the dead bird. At some point, I must have gotten too close to the dog because of my curiosity while watching, whereupon it attacked me, probably because it thought I was going to take away its prey. It then brought me down to the ground, and while standing on my chest, it grabbed me by the throat, as it was probably trained to do. This was the first bite the dog gave me. And then it tried to bite my left cheek, as well as around the area above my left eye. It also tried to bite my chest, but when I was lying on the ground, it mainly concentrated on my throat and my face. So how did this near-death experience happen then? It was relatively, well, in fact, it was something that I was half aware of and half not aware of. So it was kind of, let's say, interchangeable or sort of back and forth. What I consciously experienced was that I was lying on my mother's arm after she grabbed me, calling for help and running out into the street. In those moments, I didn't feel any pain, nor did I know what my mother was so excited about. I remember, even though never confirmed to me by anyone, that I might have called for help vaguely, and if I did, it was certainly only because I was copying my mother, and not because I had judged the situation as terrible or bad. I was seeing the situation from above, whereas my body was in my mother's arms, and so far everything was fine and good. So it was as if I was no longer in this body that was in my mother's arms. Instead, I was observing the situation from above, and so everything was good, bright, friendly, warm, and beautiful. So despite this dramatic situation, I felt a certain inner contentment, a calm and no panic at all. I couldn't really understand my mother's stories of how bad it all was for her, that my eye was hanging out of the eye socket and that I was a bleeding piece of flesh. I never could understand that I experienced it all myself. She was just telling how she experienced it, because for me, at that moment, there were 2 lives, so to speak. One life, when I was watching the scene from above, and the other life was what has happened down there. How were you rescued from this terrible situation? It all happened in bits and pieces. At some point, I don't know whether I only know it from stories or whether I witnessed it myself. Anyway, my mother called for help on the street at that time. It was a somewhat smaller place where usually there are no taxis, at least not like in a big city where taxis or other passenger transportation are usually available. But she was lucky enough in this place of all places to find a taxi driver or someone who gave her and me a lift, and the driver immediately knew the way to the trauma surgery, where medical care could be provided immediately. The individual time intervals were relatively short. I still remember lying there on a stretcher where there was a surgeon nearby, and I in fact realized that I was somewhere downstairs in the hospital, where my sweater was cut open crosswise in order to treat the wound and do everything associated with that, such as suturing the wound and stopping the bleeding, and so on. Later on, in retrospect, it was somehow strange for me not to feel any pain at all in these moments. Not even my eye was aching. It was hanging down a bit in a way that my mother intended to donate an eye for me. The scenes were not lacking in drama, yet I didn't feel any pain. And this was the strange thing about it all. In retrospect, I think that what helped me tremendously in this situation, when I found myself above, was actually, it was just bright. So I couldn't really perceive anything else. Anyway, I felt sheltered and protected, although I couldn't define who it was that was protecting and sheltering me there. So a clue would have been useful as to whether it was the Lord or the angels or something else. But in retrospect, I know that my grandfather, well, I am half Indian. My grandfather was a surgeon in India. And even though I don't know whether he was still alive at the time or whether he had already passed away, I know, and this is some kind of inner knowing, that he definitely took us to a surgeon very quickly. It is, as I said, an inner knowing that my grandfather, considering the many so-called coincidences, brought us to this surgeon without our being affected by all the impediments which were there in place. Surely, as to this you can say, she's talking herself into something, or the like. But in my opinion, my grandfather was ensuring a maximum of protection and care for me in those moments. In hindsight, I feel that way because I used to always wonder whether it was so bright and so warm, so beautiful in this special state of being, and what it was all about, because the situation in itself was dramatic and terrible. And all the time I have been looking for an answer as to what this story was all about. And just from my feeling, I came to exactly this conclusion, even though from an intellectual point of view, it is not a matter of course to understand it. What impact did this experience have on your life, on your worldview? It wasn't until much later that I was able to deal with this situation and these insights. When my father, I'll say now, crossed over into the spiritual world, because I don't like the word deceased that much, even though usually that is what we say, because I myself have come to the conclusion that the body can leave, but what about the inner life, the soul, the energy that made up this person? So I came to the conclusion that this inner essence does not pass away, but rather remains and lives on. And later, by means of this puzzle gradually fitting together, this insight helped me to realize that my father is still there for me. There are no unresolved things between me and my Father, because I was able to clarify everything afterwards, just simply because He has always been there, answering the things still unresolved. And in this way, for me, it feels like a puzzle, that in any case, my grandfather, too, was with me in order to help me, and that both are there for me whenever I need them and ask for their help. Then one could say that this experience opened the door to the spiritual for you. Definitely, as a child, as a young girl, and as a young adult, I used to always curse that incident and found it to be unpleasant, because it is, of course, not good to be disfigured. Since I have a scar here on my throat, 1 centimeter, or shall I say 1 inch from my trachea, my left cheek is deformed and my left eye is scarred, whereas on the thorax there is no longer anything to be seen, but it was a very difficult, unpleasant experience that now has really changed for the better. For if I hadn't had this experience, I wouldn't have gotten the trust and certainty that my father and my grandfather, and surely many others, will be there when I ask for them, and that I can definitely rely on them. They are there for me then, just as they would be in everyday life, even though this may sound strange. And this gives me a great deal of security in life. Also, taking away a lot of existential fear in my current life. Anita, thank you so very much for this interview.